beginning of our program here, I want to end our summer sermon series this morning by giving you part 4, the life and times of King Solomon. This summer we've been looking at the first 3 kings of Israel, and arguably the 3 greatest kings of Israel. And we haven't yet talked about the third one. Let me remind you of the context and perspective. Moses brings the Israelites out of Egypt. He frees them from Pharaoh, brings them across the desert and to the edge of the promised land, the land of Canaan. Moses dies and Joshua takes over leadership of the people. Joshua crosses the river Jordan, and under Joshua they set themselves out and create a space for the people of Israel. Each of the 12 tribes find a spot. For the next 400 years, all the loose confederation of the Israelites are ruled in each generation by a single judge. They mostly rule themselves. But when hard times come, a single great person is raised up by the Holy Spirit, and they judge and guide and help the people. And the book of Judges is a series of these people. But an enemy arises that this loose confederation cannot meet. It is the enemy of the Philistines. And so all the tribes get together and call out to the prophet of God to give us a king. And the prophet warns them and says, you don't want a king. A king will be awful for you. He's going to take all your food. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your sons. He's going to tax you like crazy. He's going to rule over you and direct you. You're going to lose your freedom. And they all say, we want a king. So Saul is anointed as the first king. Saul proves to be more interested in his own interests than God's interests. So a second king is anointed as a child. That's David. And when Saul dies, David takes over the throne. For a few years, he's only in Judah. Then for 33 years, he rules over the United Kingdom, 40 years total. And David brings the military victory they had all been hoping for. David establishes borders and boundaries bigger than anyone has ever seen. He brings peace to the realm and relative prosperity as well. When David dies, his second son under Bathsheba, you remember the Bathsheba incident? Well, his second child with Bathsheba is named Solomon. And Solomon comes to the throne of his father David. Now, if you know anything about Solomon, you probably know that he was the whatest of everyone in the world. He was the wisest person. And part of this is reading back onto what Solomon is able to do. Because if you thought Israel was great under David, you ain't seen nothing yet. We're talking about like post-World War II United States. We're talking about an economic upheaval, in a positive way. We're talking about extraordinary wealth, extraordinary peace, extraordinary growth of the population, the growth of cities, just absolute abundance coming on the people. All of it happens under Solomon. And it is such an incredible kingdom that not only does no one else in the world even dream about attacking Israel, but actually they all come to Israel asking if Solomon would give them their favor. And they're willing to do just about anything to get the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, to be kind to them. So much so that famously the queen of, does anybody know the queen of where or who comes to Solomon? The queen of Sheba. The queen of Sheba. We don't know much about the Queen of Sheba, except there it is in the Bible, in the Old Testament. The Queen of Sheba comes all the way from probably Ethiopia, all the way to Israel, and she comes before King Solomon. She's blown away by everything she sees. She's come to ask him hard questions. And if you ever hear people talking about the hard questions, this may actually be a reference to what the Bible is talking about the Queen of Sheba bringing to Solomon. And she is shocked at how incredibly educated and knowledgeable King Solomon is. His wisdom and understanding goes beyond anything that she expected or considered. She brings him like millions of dollars of gold. She brings him more spices than he's ever seen in his life. And she goes back to Ethiopia with a trade pact with the kingdom of Israel. Now, what does Solomon do to make all of this happen? As soon as Solomon becomes king, he does, I'm going to just roughly condense it into probably three things. The first thing that Solomon does is he creates alliances with all the other nations around him. Now, the key way you make an alliance in this day is that you marry somebody's daughter. There's a lot of like medieval Europe that you hear in this time for Israel. And it's not accidental. A lot of the kings and rulers of medieval Europe were looking at the Old Testament for guidance about how kings should operate and what kingdoms might look like. This is going to shock you, but King Solomon had, does anyone want to guess how many wives he ended up having, mostly from creating alliances? Just somebody throw out a number. He had 700 wives, which was apparently not enough because he had 300 concubines, which is how you get to 1,000. 700 wives. Just let that sink in. 700 wives. How does a human being even have time to meet that many people, much less marry them and bring them, every single one of them, into Jerusalem? But this is part of how he created these pacts. He also sent out, he already ruled and controlled all of the trade routes that went anywhere, coming or going. They all went through the King's Highway, which went straight through Israel. And you may remember David famously took the cities that had the trade routes in them, so that Solomon inherited all of the taxes for anything that came or went. Solomon took a portion of it. But that wasn't enough. He also created massive fleets of ships. Is it fleets or is a fleet so big it's singular? I went over that in my head. A fleet, a massive fleet or massive fleets of ships, trade ships, that would go away sometimes for 2 or 3 years at a time. And when they came back, they were just laden, absolutely overladen with gold and with spices and with like exotic woods and exotic fruits and apes and all sorts of things that you might think would be exotic and extraordinary at the time. And so he controlled the trade that went on the water, and he controlled all the trade that was on land for an entire generation. For 40 years, he was taking a portion of all of that. Now, Solomon probably is most famous for, not beyond his wisdom and beyond the extravagance of Israel, for his building projects. Solomon built like nobody's ever built. Solomon built palaces. Solomon built a house for God. There'd never been a temple before. The ark used to be the property of all of the Israelites, all of the tribes. Whoever needed the ark would get the ark, and it would come in a tent. Even under David, the ark, it came into Jerusalem, it was still in a tent. Solomon brings in Phoenician builders. He uses cypress and cedar from Lebanon. He brings massive stones again from the north, all the way down, and builds a temple like no one has ever seen before. Now, its architecture was Phoenician, and it probably annoyed lots of people. When Israelites, when they would come up to try to get to the ark, and like what you saw was Phoenician architecture instead of Israelite architecture. But Solomon wanted the best. He wanted the best materials, he wanted the best architecture, and he wanted the best architects. But not only does he build a house, the first temple, Solomon's temple, which stands for 400 years in Israel, but he builds like crazy. He builds massive palace complexes. He builds storehouses. He builds stables. He has 4 different regional cities that are collecting all of this wealth and all of this food, and each of those have massive building complexes going in them. It's a little bit like when I went to Jerusalem in the 1990s as a younger person, and I just looked around, and you looked at the skyline, and all you saw was cranes. All you saw was cranes, like huge, like up on all of the metal ladders, high above anything else, massive, huge cranes, because they were building like crazy. Everywhere you look. I mean, at any one time, 15 or 20, maybe 25 cranes that you saw because they were building everywhere and building up. This is what they were doing under Solomon. Solomon also appointed people to be in charge of the palace, people to be in charge of a board of governors, and people to be in charge of forced labor. I'll say more about those in a moment. So this gave Solomon plenty of extra time. And what did Solomon do? Well, he didn't have to war, and he had all of these alliances. He had all this money coming in. In some ways, Solomon's wisdom is a consequence of this extraordinary wealth. Well, let's put it this way. If you were extraordinarily wealthy, after you got done having everything you ever possibly dreamed of times 12, what would you spend your time doing? You might say, well, I've always wanted to learn to sculpture. I'd like to paint. I'd like to go to Egypt and learn more about the pyramids. This is what Solomon did. He had all the time in the world to learn everything that could be learned about anything, and is probably how he got to be so wise. Part of it, of course, was a gift from God, an internal, a discernment of the heart. But also, he had time to learn everything, which is probably what shocked the Queen of Sheba. My God, this guy knows everything about everything. Or he thought he did. According to her and according to the Bible, he actually did. So Solomon is credited for writing the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, which is a really interesting book about wisdom. It's actually a book about sort of the emptiness of wealth, which is fascinating. He also writes the book of Proverbs, and probably doesn't write all the Proverbs, but the thought is that he collected over 3,000 Proverbs from the entire ancient Near East. Essentially, he was looking for any words of wisdom that anybody knew, clever aphorisms or thoughtful sayings. One of my favorite ones, and I won't quote it exactly, but it's something like, the best time to determine where a fallen tree should land is as it's beginning to fall. And I think about this a lot, because just as it's tipping, you could push it in any direction, right? But once it's down, try to move it to the other side. It's sort of where you see its wisdom. It's like, if you act early, if you act with understanding and intent, it can be a lot easier and you'll get just what you need. But if you wait too long, it's going to be really hard to change it. So work ahead, right? That's just one of 3,000 Proverbs that you find in the book of Proverbs. He also writes, or is credited as having written the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. And considering that he had 1,000 lovers of one sort or another, it's a, can I say that word? I won't say that word. It's a love poem. It's a little bit hot in some places. It can make you blush, the Song of Solomon. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's part of who we are as human beings. And directed rightly to a person who you have a commitment with, these are good things, right? But it's in there, and it's hot. It's a complete love story, love poem about Solomon and his beloved. And often interpreted as God and God's love and desire for humanity. That God's always watching, that's always God. He's looking through the window for us, calling for us to leave our regular life and come and join ourselves to him. Solomon's end is ignoble, whatever the correct grammar is there. It doesn't end that great for Solomon. And that's because in everything that I've just mentioned, he was also sowing seeds of discontent. This is one reason I think this book is so valuable in the Bible, is that to learn about Solomon and his kingdom, it's not necessarily talking about our relationship with Christ, okay? That's why that part's in there. But what it talks to us about is this is a portrait of a life which in many ways was extraordinarily successful, but because it's strategic theology, right? Strategic spirituality, how to think about the world and how to manage your life in such a way that things work well. Because Solomon didn't do that, you see in his life a picture of a life that could have been so extraordinary and could have been generations of kingdoms beyond him, but in fact, because of his strategic mistakes, ended up being quite a disaster. and we can learn from some of those things. For example, and this is, well, I don't want to say the key one, but I will say, I'm saying it first for a reason. Solomon, when he's young, loves God. His heart is like just as warm as David's was for God. He's so excited about bringing the ark into Jerusalem. He really wants to give God a home, and he makes it beautiful on purpose. But over the course of time, Solomon becomes less and less, he cares less and less about God, essentially. It's a little bit of a sad story about wealth, giving somebody everything that they ever wanted, and so they stop asking, or they stop caring, or they stop yearning for something more and deeper. Over the course of time, Solomon really loses his focus on God. The Bible puts some of the blame on the fact that he had 700 wives. That could be another lesson for any of us. Is sort of, if you divide yourself into too many pieces, you're going to lose yourself. These 700 wives, each of them seemingly brought their own priests of their own gods, of their own temples, and the desire for their own shrines into Jerusalem. And Solomon started giving his wives property and land in Jerusalem so they could build their shrines. So young Jerusalem was this beautiful, bustling place of wealth and prosperity with this beautiful temple to God. And old Jerusalem under Solomon was like, there's God's temple, and here's 1,000 other temples with 1,000 other priests and sacrifices in Jerusalem, in the shadow of the temple being made to all of these other gods. And you can imagine, they were there for the wives, ostensibly, but you can imagine some of the people of Israel getting really angry, and other people of Israel thinking, oh, this God is interesting, or oh, this God is interesting. Monotheism and love of God had kept the people together. And under this sort of new polytheistic, their diversity had not been their strength. Their commonality of God had been their strength. And by bringing in this diversity, it actually brought in something that fractured them from the inside. I might, by the way, suggest in the United States, our diversity is our strength. So it may be the opposite for us. That if we were to say, we don't want diversity, we all want to be one thing again, we would be turning our back on what makes us strong. But in their case, it really fractured the nation from the inside. It fractured the beginning in their hearts. Another seriously terrible, bad thing Solomon did was he disaffected the people. He was so worried about wealth and looking good and being good and having things. He was more worried about that than people. He was worried about getting money than who he was extracting it from and what their lives were like. He became blind to the lives of his people. As a king, he lost track of what his people were experiencing and just kept asking from them more and more. So, for example, those of you who had children, each of the children that you would have, your boys would have to spend 1 month out of 3 in forced labor under Solomon's chief of forced labor. And by the whip, for an entire month, your sons would be forced to drag these massive stones all the way from Lebanon, all the way down to Jerusalem, and find out ways to stack them on top of each other. Some of them would die, some of them would become exhausted. They would come back with their hearts broken, their minds broken, their bodies broken. And Solomon didn't care because he was building. And aren't the buildings so beautiful? This reminds me of when Jesus is walking with his disciples much later in Jerusalem, and they say, look how big the stones are. And Jesus said, it's not about the stones, my friend. The stones can be stacked, and one day the stones will fall. It's not about the stones. It's not about the buildings. It's about the people. It's about the spirit. It's about the heart. Solomon lost track of that, and the people got more and more frustrated, especially in the north. The north, sort of Galilee area, the northern tribes, the northern 10 tribes, they were further from Jerusalem, so they were more apt to rebel. So he was harder on them, plus all the stuff was coming down from the north. So the people in the north were also being stressed way more than the people of Judah. Solomon had been from Judah. Judah was right there next to Jerusalem. Judah was getting richer and richer and richer. Meanwhile, the people in the north were getting more and more exhausted. Solomon also exacted taxes from the people to such an extraordinary degree. For example, he created 12 different geographical entities that were not the tribes. So he was trying to erase their tribal identity, which they also didn't like. And then each of these 12 areas was responsible for feeding him and all of his royal people during 1 month. And so, section 1 will feed us in January. And section 2 will feed us in February. Section 3, and we're going to take your horses, and we're going to take your wine, we're going to take your oil, we're going to take your grain, we're going to take whatever it is that's being harvested then, and you're going to be feeding Solomon this month. In the end, he also created a system that was entirely dependent on him. All the decisions came from him, his charisma, his power, his authority. So that when Solomon came towards the end of his life, all of these seeds began to sort of sprout into rebellion. And it would have taken somebody, a great, noble, extraordinarily wise king of 40 years to hold it together. But that person was dying. And the person who was coming up was his hot-headed son named Rehoboam. Rehoboam, on Solomon dying, becomes king, and he goes up to the north, and all the leaders of the north come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and they say, please relax all the stuff. Please relax the taxes. Please relax the forced labor. Please relax everything you're demanding from us, and give us a little more freedom. Give us a little bit more space. And the scripture says that Rehoboam asked his old wise advisors, and they all said, it's beyond time. Give him a break. And then Rehoboam, wanting to look fancy in the eyes of his peers, asked his young, unexperienced advisors, who were his own age, what should we do? And they said, oh, you have to show them you're strong. Show them that you're focused. Show them that you're not going to relent, that you will not fall away from what your father did, but double the effort you require of them. And then they'll know that you intend to be a great king. So Rehoboam famously says to the people, under my father Solomon, you were disciplined with whips, but under me you shall be disciplined with scorpions. Guess what happened? That was the end of the United Kingdom. The kingdom that Saul had brought together into one, that David had expanded militarily, that Solomon had expanded in wealth and in prestige. His son Rehoboam ended up splitting, although as we've seen, it was partly Solomon's fault. The northern 10 kingdoms, which kept the name Israel, split apart and become their own kingdom. Judah and a little bit of Benjamin becomes a separate kingdom. And these two kingdoms are bound to never come together. The northern kingdom ends up having 19 kings over the next 200 years. So each one only served for 10 years or less. The scripture says every single one of them did evil in the sight of the Lord. And after 230 years, the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians. Their capital was in Samaria. So in Jesus' day, the Samaritans are the descendants of that northern kingdom, the bad kingdom, the rebels, who have been destroyed by Assyria, also sort of interconnected with their gods and their culture. The southern kingdom only lasted for about 100 years more, until it was destroyed by Babylon. And now there was no kingdoms at all. And all the people of Israel ended up in exile in Babylon. This is why in the Old Testament there's sort of two great pillars of trial. There's the Exodus in Egypt as slaves, and there's the exile in Babylon, essentially as slaves or forced workers. And around these two pillars, the entire Old Testament is built. I hope this has helped you not only to understand the Old Testament better, and maybe to understand Jesus just a little bit better, but also to think in maybe more strategic and, more holy ways about your own life. About the effects of our actions on other people, about the effects of our values on the systems around us as time goes on. To remind us that to keep our hearts focused on God, to worry about the people more than the things, is to let the Spirit of God lead you. It's what made Solomon so great in his youth, and the lack of it was what made him so weak. There is a lesson here for each of us.